basically Egypt has succeeded in toppling the reign of Mubarak, or I don't know if it's Mubarak or Mubarak or how exactly that goes. So whether they continue to apply pressure and kind of push for democracy, or they simply content themselves with a new autocrat or a theocrat, that kind of still remains to be seen. So there are similar protests now, at least from what I'm reading, that are taking place in Algeria, and Iran is on the cusp of something like this happening, apparently. There's a lot of discontent in the Middle East right now. Most of the protesters, if you look at the polls, say they want democracy, which I think is good, obviously. They want their own voices heard, and I think that's something they have in common with most Americans, certainly. But there's some things that we don't have in common, too, and I hate to draw attention to our differences, but sometimes that's important. We don't have the same views on religion and politics as they do, because the same Pew poll that I referenced before, which some of my Muslim viewers got very angry at that poll and say that's not an accurate picture, but it is a poll of 1,000 Egyptians in face-to-face interviews. Maybe that's too small of a sample to get an accurate picture, but
Oh, it's too small a sample.
it's
But still, it's a start. It's
I
a
mean,
start.
it can at least kind of take the temperature a little bit.
Right.
Um, and when a poll shows 95% support for increased religious role in government, you can at least safely assume that with a sample size of 1,000 people, that's at least somewhat accurate. There's no way it's that far from that number. Thankfully, according to the same poll, only about 20% of Egyptians have any real sort of support for things like suicide bombing, and it's only like something like 8% that strongly endorse it. So,
Right.
which, in all fairness, is probably about the same percentage of Americans who want to nuke the Middle East. So, I'm not too concerned about that. Although it's a lot easier to get your hands on a bomb that you strap to your body than it is to get your hands on a nuclear arsenal, at least for now. 70% of Egyptians are very concerned about Islamist extremism, which is good, but our definitions of extremism are pretty different from theirs, because 49% of Egyptians support Hamas and 30% support Hezbollah, at least according to this small sample, admittedly small. And more Egyptians than not support a segregated workplace. They don't want to work with women. The exact figures are 44% oppose and 54% favor workplace gender segregation. So while liberals like me are very excited, and rightfully so, about these changes in Egypt, we need to understand that a lot of the values that we despise in the American right are even more strongly and in even greater numbers,
I love it. I love it. Okay.
espoused by the people of Egypt. So, I mean, you don't like Rush Limbaugh? Well, imagine a country where there's a lot more of him. I mean, So I mean, I don't get this. I mean, I think that some of these attitudes might soften a little bit if they do get democracy brought to their country, because that does tend to quell these sort of pent-up aggressions a little bit. But there's still some stuff to be worried about here if this poll is accurate, and it's Pew research, and that's a pretty respectable polling company, so I'd imagine they are at least decently accurate. I'm going to stop my ranting here and let you go.
Well, the fucking revolution in Egypt is absolutely amazing, but I suspect that every revolution that we've had, from the revolution in Paris in 1789, not to mention, well, the revolution in the United States wasn't a revolution by the kind of definition of revolution we're talking about. And, every single one of them, 1917 in Russia, 1959 in Cuba, 1979 in Iran. I'm sure every single one of them was amazing. And in the same way that Barack Obama appealed to us by using the mantra of change, but not exactly filling in what he meant, so that each of us could project our own hopes, our own dreams onto that blank screen of change. A revolution arrives with a big blank screen, and we all project what we really want onto it. And when we think that everything that we've wanted is about to happen, not realizing that there are other people who want just the opposite of what we want, who are also glowing with optimism, because they're absolutely sure that everything they've wanted is just around the corner, even if that includes my annihilation, your annihilation, or whatever. So it's a very precarious time in the history of a revolution. But the fact is that these revolutionaries have done some really extraordinary things. They have used the word freedom over and over and over and over and over again. Now that's a loaded term. I mean, you know, a long time ago, people under Vercingetorix rebelled for freedom. These were the Celts and the Gauls. They rebelled for freedom against the oppression of the Roman Empire. But guess what freedom consisted of? It consisted of the ability to have your ears cut off, your nose cut off, if you disagreed with Vercingetorix, the guy who was running the revolution. Freedom meant the ability to have your own private Mubarak telling you exactly what to do and killing you if you didn't do it. Why? Because he was your Mubarak. He was your Vercingetorix. He wasn't somebody else's Vercingetorix, for God's sakes. So there are different varieties of freedom, and some of them are a lot less free than others. I'm losing the thread here. I'm losing the track. The point is that these people did things like, okay, George Bush used to talk in the early days of the 21st century about bringing democracy to the Middle East. And indeed, back in those days, the early 21st century, inspired to some extent by America, there were demonstrations in the streets of Cairo, run by the Muslim Brotherhood, actually. There were demonstrations in the streets of Lebanon. There were demonstrations in several Islamic countries. And when I put together what was called a kitchen cabinet, a little group that I ran at 2 o'clock in the morning, pulling together a friend from the State Department, a friend who was the leading expert on open source intelligence, who helped put together the U.S. Marines Intelligence College or something like that, and another friend who was the former Minister of Education for Malaysia, and said, is this for real? Or is the press just getting overly optimistic? My friend from Malaysia, my friend who is a Muslim, period, who's on the list of the top 100 Muslim scholars in the world from UNESCO, who also founded two of the leading scholarly publications in the world of Islam. My friend said, do not lose hope in us. We do want democracy. And this is a friend who puts a quote from Thomas Jefferson on the bottom of every one of his letters. Now, of course, there's a good chance that, last week, there's a real problem for people like my friend Munawar Anis, the former Minister of Education for Malaysia. He wants freedom. A few other people have wanted freedom. But a week ago, a mob of 40,000 people, an organized crowd of 40,000 people, got together for a peaceful street protest in the streets of one of the major cities of Pakistan. And do you have any idea of what they were peacefully protesting for?
No.
Well, there are blasphemy laws in Pakistan, and if you say anything that can be interpreted as blasphemous, in other words, if you say anything that can be interpreted as the least bit slighting against the Prophet Muhammad, who after all carried the word of God and is the only prophet who ever successfully managed to get it across, if you say anything the least bit insulting, or that anybody can construe as insulting, by whatever stretch of the imagination, you can be convicted of blasphemy. And guess what the penalty is for blasphemy? Didn't we do this in our last episode? Okay, back to this. Back to the penalty for blasphemy. What is it, TJ?
I'm assuming it's death by some...
Yes, of course. It's
some death. Sort of barbaric means.
Kill them! Slit their throats! Hang them! Yes, they're very emphatic about this. And I mean, my rate of enthusiasm for killing them all, kill, as what's his name said. Oh God, the son of the famous folk singer when he did Alice's Restaurant. Back in the 1960s. But my enthusiasm for murder, or at least that which I am aping and satirizing here, is nothing compared to the genuine enthusiasm in the streets of Pakistan. And what in the world brought them to demonstrate, to maintain the freedom to have their blasphemy laws? A Christian woman had done something that was considered blasphemous, and she had been put under a death sentence. A modernist, pluralist governor of one of the states, one of the few men in Pakistan or any place else in the Islamic world willing to raise his voice against the militant crazies, went to her jail cell several times, thus endorsing the idea that maybe she should live. Now, do you know what he was what sort of reward he got for this beneficent and generous act, showing that indeed Allah is the most kind and the most compassionate God?
I'm assuming he was either killed or something else horrible happened to him.
Yes, his high-level security guy put 37 bullets into him. And guess what? Guess what the general attitude was toward this guy who had been mowed down with something like 37 bullets? But no, more important, guess what the attitude was toward the person who had shot him?
Hero.
A national hero overnight. You got it. You're doing very well on this test. So that's what was going on over the last 2 weeks in Pakistan, the country that brought us the Salman Rushdie affair, where they wanted death for Salman Rushdie instantly, the country that brought us the riots that have inspired people to try to kill the Danish cartoonists, the anti-Danish cartoonist riots. Are these people for freedom of speech, TJ?
Very strong advocates of any speech that they like.
Yes, exactly. And, well, like Rush Limbaugh, kill the ones who say the things I don't like. Now, who else do we know that rants in front of a microphone? Rush Limbaugh! But that's nothing compared to the ranting, I would imagine, in Pakistan. Now,
I get to rant in front of a video camera, so.
Well, in Malaysia, Malaysia is one of those two. No, it was Indonesia. Malaysia and Indonesia are way out on the farther reaches of Islam, and they are separated from all this craziness of these wild Arabs and Middle Easterners. They're a different people. They're a much calmer people. They're Asians, for God's sakes. And their version of Islam is far, far more tolerant than the versions of Islam you'll find in the center of the Islamic heartland, the Middle East. So guess what happened last week with a little mob in Indonesia?
No idea.
They didn't like something a local Christian person had said. So what do you think they did to register their discontent, their disagreement?
I don't know.
To dialogue.
Tell me.
They burned down a Christian church and beat 3 people they found in the vicinity of the Christian church to death.
Yeah, that's pretty effective. That's one way of going about things.
So, a friend of mine like Munawar Anis, who was the former Minister of Education for Malaysia, may put Thomas Jeffersonian quotes at the bottom of his emails, but the fact is he's up against a good deal of opposition even in his own country. In Pakistan, one of my greatest fans, who happens to be a Muslim atheist, something he doesn't dare say out loud, or guess what he could be accused of?
Blasphemy!
Blasphemy! Killing him! Hang him!
And apostasy.
Okay.
Sorry. Also apostasy.
Yes, my enthusiasm overwhelmeth me. But at any rate, these people live in serious danger because look what happened to the governor who went to a Christian woman's jail cell because she was under a death sentence for probably not saying anything of any particular consequence whatsoever. It just was interpreted as blasphemy, and anything can be interpreted as blasphemy. Everything we are now saying is, guess what? B-L-A-S-P-H-E-M-Y, blasphemy! Kill him!
Kill us both. I remember there was I don't remember what country it was because I'm not good with that sort of thing, but there was recently a student in one of the Islamic countries that was being sentenced to death for blasphemy because of a smart-ass answer he gave on a quiz that he was given in school.
Yes. There was one 3 years ago, and he asked a question. He committed blasphemy by asking a question.
Well, no, this is more recent. This was only...
the recent one was last week. But the one 3 years ago was really remarkable because, okay, now look, apparently, and in all my years, decades of studying Islam, I've never quite gotten this straight, but apparently to be a Muslim, you have to shave your balls.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Well, it's hard to figure it out, but at any rate, so, okay, now remember, until he was 40 years old, Muhammad lived like everybody else in that part of the Middle East, way out in the desert in Mecca, and believed whatever the hell they believed. The rest of the people around him believed because it wasn't until he was 40 years old that he went to a cave and was held in a bear hug, clutched to the point of breathlessness, by what he later interpreted to be the angel Gabriel, who he later interpreted to have said to him, read, which is a small problem because he was illiterate. But aside from that, in other words, he didn't have his direct contact with God, or indirect contact, because it was through the angel Gabriel, until he was 40 years old. So the student asked the following question: did Muhammad shave his balls before he was 40 years old? In other words, did Muhammad do the things that are required of a Muslim before he was 40 years old? And that question was considered blasphemy. In Greece, in 450 BC, that question would have been considered the beginning of wisdom and philosophy. But the Islamic world is not Greece. You still there? I hear an ominous silence.
I'm still here.
Okay, you're just stunned into silence by the idea of shaving your balls. I don't blame you. Okay.
I was stunned into silence by the idea of being executed for such a
Logical question.
obvious and logical question.
Yes, a question
Then
that
again,
goes.
religion's never been too good with the whole question thing. But
So, well, now the reports on the student who was accused of blasphemy a week ago did not report in what manner it was considered that he may have committed blasphemy. All it said was that his test paper went to his professor or teacher, and beyond his teacher, it went to a local administrator who took a look at it and was horrified and immediately concluded that it was blasphemy. For what reason does not matter. Again, it's a death sentence. So
yeah,
here's
the article that I read said basically that they would not repeat the blasphemy because it was so
what explanation.
so horrendous. We cannot repeat what was written on this paper.
Okay, whereas Muhammad's balls were able to get into the press.
Yeah, so it must have been really bad. They must have talked about Muhammad's asshole or something, you know.
Yes, exactly. Okay, now here's the deal in Egypt. Here's how this relates to Egypt. Some of those Egyptian protesters made a great point about using the word secular. They didn't just say democracy, they said secular democracy. It was said several times at least, and it was said in front of the public. Not that that matters, because it was said in English. The big question is what was said in Arabic, but that's another matter. These people also, the protesters, some of them went out of their way to march down the streets arm in arm with Coptic Christians. Some of them. Not all of them, some of them. We don't know how few, we don't know how many. But one thing that does indicate there's been a tremendous amount of westernization in their attitudes since the days when George Bush was pushing a democracy or democratization of the Middle East is this. The people in Tahrir Square, I can never pronounce the name right, so forgive me if I got it wrong. The people in the square, 55,000 square meter square, cleaned up after themselves. They got together little squads to clean up after themselves. And when they cleaned up after themselves, they separated the trash. They separated it into organic and inorganic trash. Now, maybe that's just some old Muslim tradition that in 40 or 50 years of studying Islam, I have not previously run across. But to my mind, it sounds distinctly environmentarianist. It sounds very much like we learned to do in the wake of the environmental movement that began in 1969 and then gained momentum. I mean, we've been recycling our trash by separating it for a long time. But they did a whole bunch of other things that indicated that they have a Western secular democracy in mind. And one of the things that indicates the most that they have a Western secular democracy in mind is this. The Saudi government owns a newspaper. It is called Asharq al-Wasat. It comes out in English and it comes out in Arabic, and it's international. And there is a large English-speaking international community. This is not a paper written for you and me. It is not a paper written for propaganda purposes. It is written for Muslim, Arab-speaking Muslims spread out all over the world, especially in the English-speaking world. And in Asharq al-Wasat, there were two very different kinds of articles about the Egyptian Revolution. One was an article written by the kind of cleric that the Wahhabis, I mean, remember, Saudi Arabia is run by a group that's as wildly religiously intolerant as anything else in the Muslim world. It's the Wahhabi movement. And the Wahhabi movement is 270 years old and still sticks to the principles of 270 years ago. It wants Jews dead. It wants Israel exterminated. It wants you to have the freedom to live in truth, which means it wants you, and justice, which means it wants you to have the freedom to live as a Muslim believer. It wants you to have the freedom to live under Sharia law, which would, of course, put you to death for blasphemy.
I'd be gone.
Yes, since you utter blasphemy with every other breath you take.
I'm really bad with the blasphemy thing.
Yes, you would have been gone as soon as they hauled you out of your mother's womb and you screamed while being spanked by the doctor your first breaths of Wah! Blasphemy. That's you, TJ. Sorry. You would have been gone. I would have been gone within a fraction of a second. Well, that's the freedom they want for us. The freedom to be gone. At any rate, so the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia are remarkably intolerant and inflexible people who have spent over $70 billion to promote the spread of Wahhabism worldwide, including founding madrasas all over the place that do not teach freedom, tolerance, and pluralism, that teach the opposite, that teach intolerance and a lack of pluralism. One way, the only way, the Islamic way. Nonetheless, in a newspaper owned by the Saudi Wahhabi state, there was what you would expect. There was an article saying, by a cleric, saying that the Egyptian revolution was a manifestation of a kind of revolution that's been taking place in the Middle East ever since the 1950s. It is a revolution of Muslim people trying to be free to live under God's own law, under Sharia. And it pointed out a history of these revolutions and said every one of these revolutions was stolen from us, was hijacked, because every single one was a manifestation of an Islamic awakening, trying to get to the pure Wahhabi kind of Sharia that would put women in veils and would make men meek and would make students very, very careful about what they might say on their exam papers and whose balls they might question. And every one of these great awakenings had been stolen, but this time it was time to make sure that the great awakening of Sharia-style Islam, intolerant Islam, was not stolen, and that the revolution of Sharia be allowed to take place in Egypt. Well, that's what you'd expect from Saudi Arabia. However, the editor of Asharq al-Wasat has a very, very different opinion. And he has expressed it in article after article after article, far, far, far more articles than this one lonely article from a cleric. And he has said that what the Islamic people have, what the Egyptian people have revolted for is freedom, which means freedom of speech, freedom to live in a modern state, freedom to develop their education, freedom to develop their technology, freedom to develop their science, which of course for him means freedom to develop their nuclear weapons, but that's another subject for another time. And the kinds of freedoms that you and I expect. In other words, the editor of this very Saudi publication has very modernist, very pluralist, well, I wouldn't say pluralist, very modernist viewpoints. And he does want democracy. And he wants modern, and he used this word, and it was daring of him to use this word in a Saudi newspaper, secular democracy. He doesn't want Sharia. He wants secular democracy.
Yeah, that's even a dirty word in a lot of America, so.
Yes, well, that's true. So, I mean, he wants, if he said secular humanist democracy, then even the Christians would regard him as demonic.
I think some will say it just as secular. I mean, I think the Glenn Becks and Sarah Palins of the world, even secular is a little bit too far.
Well, so here we go. A bunch of people in Egypt want a secular democracy. Now, what happens in every major culture, in every culture? There are subcultures. There are usually about 4 going subcultures in any overarching culture.
At least.
It's true of Egypt. It's true of the Middle East. So the big trick for the next 2 months to 2 years is to make sure that these secularist, pluralist, modernist Muslims win their revolution. Toppling Mubarak is only step number one. Winning the revolution, winning the right to write the Constitution, and winning the right beyond that to participate in elections, to have parties of their own. Those are all critical things, crucial things. Okay, now you would think that with all of the enthusiasm and all of the positivism in the streets of Cairo, these things would be automatic. No, they're far from automatic. We pointed out last time that in the revolution in 1789 in France, so much turmoil was created that the secularist, pluralist modernists who started out as Democrats ended up cutting off heads, 40,000 of them. 40,000 heads in a world that had a population 1/8 the population of today's world, so that's the equivalent of 250,000 heads.
Right, and then they elected the Marquis de Sade, one of their governors, which is
Yes,
also
and
fun.
then he welcomed Napoleon, who was able to take over because they had made such a botch of things, a bloody botch at that. Then 1917, the world greeted that revolution with enormous enthusiasm. It thought that finally there was going to be freedom for the serfs in Russia, but that's not what happened. What happened was, and we went over this last time, the Mensheviks, the party of the majority, who were modernist, pluralist, put together a Duma, a parliament, a democratically elected parliament. And there they were running their democratically elected parliament when along came a little guy whose party never got more than 5% of the vote. Never more than 5 out of 100 people voting for him. But he was willing to use violence. Violence was a terrific force multiplier. He had a great big war chest. He was extremely well financed because the Germans were backing him, because they wanted, as we said last time, they wanted the Russians out of the war, for God's sakes, so they can concentrate on pounding the hell out of and conquering the rest of Europe. And because he was willing to use violence, this little Stupnik, with only 5% of the vote, took over utterly and gave us Joseph Stalin. And guess what Stalin did to set the serfs free?
Uh, Not too much.
He killed roughly 20 million of them. He called them kulaks. He starved them to death. He sent them off to gulags to starve to death if they didn't starve to death in the train stations, and they were starving to death in the train stations. So these revolutions, and of course we know what happened to the revolution of 1959 in Cuba. It was advertised even to the Cuban people as a revolution for freedom of speech and democracy. Fidel Castro himself gave interviews to 3 major American magazines explaining how much freedom and democracy he represented. It was all the freedom and democracy in the world. And then he put a man in charge of the presidency who was a front, a man who believed that this was a revolution for freedom and democracy with all his heart and soul, because that's what he stood for, was freedom and democracy. And Fidel, behind the scenes, had a closet cabinet. Fidel had a shadow government, and his shadow government was very distinctly a Marxist-Leninist government in the tradition of Lenin, who took over the revolution by violence in 1917, Stalin, who set the peasants free by killing them. That was what Fidel Castro had in mind all along. He hijacked his own fucking revolution.
That's one definition of freedom, anyway.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, you can do anything.
How can you be freer than death?
Yes, exactly. So, and in 1979, in 1979, we all thought Americans were wildly enthusiastic, just like we had been in 1959 about the revolution in Iran, and we thought it was going to lead to freedom and justice, and we thought it was going to lead to all of the things that we imagine a revolution should lead to, and so did most of the people in the streets of Iran who were revolutionizing, who were revolting. And guess what they got? The
Nothing.
bloody Ayatollah.
They got it. They got the same thing that we often get when we revolt for some reason.
Yes, it's called getting the shaft, or the greased pole, or something of the sort. Although Poles could be offended by that. I'm sorry to Poland. I apologize.
I want to talk about something that was kind of a weird juxtaposition. And I know you like juxtapositions, because one of your favorite, one of my favorite of your epigrams, or bloomisms, as you sometimes call them, opposites are joined at the hip.
Yes, absolutely.
Which I don't know if this is a correct interpretation of that, but I always thought of that as like what human beings perceive as antagonism is often really a sort of collaboration or
Antagonism is a bonding mechanism
yeah.
of all.
I was thinking of it as a sort of what happening going on in Egypt as almost like a ritual or a test. When I look at the Egypt uh, situation, I'm sure everyone who fought for democracy legitimately believed in it, and I'm sure Mubarak and his thugs legitimately wanted no part of it. But the rules that govern, well, nature, I guess, including us human beings, were really testing whether this society was ready to take off the shackles of its totalitarianism. I mean, you can't win democracy without a fight because a society that isn't willing to endure to achieve democracy cannot possibly hope to sustain it. Um, but here's the unfortunate flip side of that, in my opinion. Um, it's my perception. The more I read, and I might just be the victim of the left wing fear mongering here, but it's my perception that the people of America are no longer willing to fight for or believe in their own democracy. I think that and there's a lot of people out there that are giving them something to fight for, but I view these as kind of the wrong people because um, it's basically this new very libertarian breed of conservative who their idea is basically let's give our power to business interests. Um, let's govern ourselves with a profit motive. Let's let private business build the roads. Let's do away with public everything. Every shred of land you walk on will be owned by somebody. Everything you look at and see will belong to someone. Someone will have paid for it and bought it. You know, when I drive on when I drive on the roads, I like to know that I'm not just renting the road from someone. I own it. I'm a partial owner. When I walk through a park with a friend, I like to know that it's my park and it's their park.
Right,
I don't want to think of it as someone else's park that I'm just being allowed to trespass upon.
right. Donald Trump's parking.
You
He's
know,
going to say, yeah, "I'm fired. You're fired" from the bushes at any moment.
I think there's just like it's just there seems like to be this false claim that this sort of world would be a world where we take responsibility for ourselves, but I think that it's really a matter of trying to deprive us from what's ours and give it to private interests. And those private interests, they'll take care of us in exchange for our money. And money, as you pointed out in The Genius of the Beast, is just a symbol. They don't really want the money. They want the power.
Yes, exactly.
They want to make the deal sound appealing by claiming they'll give us greater freedom, and they will to an extent because they don't have as much vested interest in what we do with our personal lives as long as they're getting our money.
Right.
But the price of that freedom is that we won't any longer have any say in the way things are run. I mean, our incomes would give us some power, but with such a large portion of the wealth concentrated in the hands of the top 1%, it's going to be the elites who have the real power. I mean, it's going to be those elites that decide policy in America. So I'm kind of worried about this meeting of Egypt and America, or the Middle East and America, where the Middle East is going up and America's going down, and we're just going to cross paths at some point. So that's my concern. Am I
Oh,
being
I think it's fucking brilliant. I think it's terrific. First of all, on the eternal vigilance is the price of liberty deal. Yes, absolutely. Look, when two stags go up against each other, two male stags, I mean, in the business of stag competition, competition between two male deer, which is what stags are, is a really big deal. Because if it's you versus me and you win, you get 32 females. Guess what I get?
nothing?
That's right. Absolutely nothing. So there's a lot at stake here over who's going to win. And do you know what the primary mechanism is with which with two stags wear each other down, with which they compete? It isn't violence. Violence is a relatively minor part of the ritual. The big deal is when they walk side by side, looking at each other out of the corners of their eyes. and they walk side by side to show each other just how big they are. But there's something else that they're showing that's even more important than their physical size, and it's their confidence. It is their willing to put all of their energy into this competition. It is their willingness to endure no matter what. It is their willingness to rise above the other in spiritual strength, if you want to call it that. You've got two deers here, two stags. Even if physical size is not going to carry the day. Now, what does that mean when it comes to defending democracy? It means that democracies, humans live in a battlefield, a continuous competition between social groups. There's a competition between subcultures within the groups, and then there's a competition within the groups between the United States, Germany, Russia in the old days, in the days of World War I and World War II. Now between the United States, Japan, China, India, Russia, and the Islamic world. And guess who wins in these competitions? He who stands the tallest, not necessarily because of his physical size, but because of his emotional strength, because of his confidence, because of his ability, his willingness to put everything he has into this competition, because of his persistence, because of his endurance, because of his courage, because of his moral force. And we're lacking all those things, but we are not lacking them entirely in America's society. As you pointed out, they are coming to the fore in the Tea Party. They are coming to the fore in the conservative part of the Republican Party. And to my mind, as your mind, I believe that those particular movements want nothing to do with freedom whatsoever. I believe that my subculture, which is the secular, pluralist, free speech subculture, I believe that our subculture is the one that holds the keys to freedom. But we are wimps, and we are laying down like doormats, and we are letting people walk all over us. And the only enemies we perceive are the Tea Party, and even for them, we can't get up the courage to organize. Even for them, we cannot get the courage to assert ourselves. Yes, we complain and whine when the Supreme Court makes an asshole decision that in every way undercuts your freedom and mine. The decision to allow corporations to spend their billions overwhelming the political process and wiping out your voice and mine. That's grotesque. But what are we doing about it? Nothing. What is the Tea Party doing? What are the conservatives doing? The conservatives just finished a major conference in Washington. I believe it was in Washington. It just finished today. They had 12,000 people there. They were voting for their own favorite candidates. Ron Paul won for the second year in a row. Ron Paul wants GE to own your roads. Ron Paul wants Microsoft to run your kitchen, in which case the blender would chop you up and leave the food alone.
Don't forget he wants to return to the gold standard, too.
Yeah.
Let's go a rung down on the symbol stack, as the genius of the beast might phrase it.
Well, but the point is, you're right. We have to stand up for our freedoms. You are right. The Egyptians have just stood up, many of them, for the very freedoms we have. And we don't recognize their value. Give me a break. My fan in Pakistan, the atheist, who, if he expressed his atheism out loud in Pakistan, could be killed for blasphemy, says you don't realize until you've been out of the United States just how rare what you have in America is. It's the only country that has the kind of freedoms that it has. The only country. Here in Pakistan, he says, we live in a location where just 2 miles away from my home, mobs can gang up on somebody and beat him to death. And that's normal. That's normal. And that does not happen in the United States. It's so abnormal that when it happens in one small corner of the country, it makes national headlines. And national headlines are a way of saying never again to an event of that kind. So here we are, in his view, my friend from Pakistan's view, the fucking light of the fucking world. but the light is going out because we are not greasing it with our own passions and with our own commitment. And that light cannot go out. I'm sorry, it cannot go out. Sorry, I get a little emotional.
It's all right. I feel you. You know, it's just crazy. Uh, I did want to get into something that you and I were talking about a little earlier, and before we got into the actual video session, you said one of the things you wanted to talk about is how the cosmos uses these acts of rebellion to test out new ideas. Basically, I think the term you used a lot in your most recent book was the universe googling its possibilities. Forgive me if I'm butchering that.
Oh, no, that's you got it. You got it.
But democracy. Democracy is not a new idea. I mean, it's an idea that's been tried and it's found to work better than anything else we've yet discovered. However, as democracy is perhaps burgeoning in the Middle East, fingers crossed on that one, uh, I think it's dying in America, as we just discussed. A lot of people are apathetic about voting, including myself up until recently when I had a change of heart about it. And many of those who do vote are voting for politicians who, as we talked about, are going to try to take power away from the democratically controlled government and give it to the financially controlled corporations. And I mean, if votes are what distributes power, then everyone has at least a little power. If money is what controls power, then power belongs to whoever has the money. So, if we follow this path, then in a few generations, I wouldn't be surprised if Egypt and the United States had reversed roles. But I mean, that's a kind of a stretch. But it's not impossible at this point. But I want to know, it kind of scares me, this idea of the cosmos testing new ideas, because certainly this radical libertarianism, this radical libertarianist streak in the Republican Party is a new idea, and I don't want this to be the testing ground. I'd like some other country to have to deal with the burden of being that experiment. So, what do we do to subvert that?
Well,
Is there any way, or are we just on the a strong, strange tide that we have no ability to manipulate?
no, we have demonstrated several times what we do to stand against this. For one thing, one of those we talked last time about the fact that I have a friend with 36 racehorses and 12 show dogs, and he sires the horses in Europe and he raises the horses in Kentucky, and you can imagine what that costs. It costs more money for one horse than you and I will probably ever see in a lifetime, much less 36 horses or his 4 homes or whatever the hell he has. And the people on the far right now are acting as his shills. They are acting in order to, when they talk about their own personal liberty, they've now been deceived by the notion that pumping money into my friends' pockets is going to provide them with some kind of personal liberty. I'm sorry, that diminishes their personal liberty. It doesn't enhance their personal liberty. So people right now are being conned, but there have been some signs that the people on our side, the sort of liberal side of things, are not entirely dead. George Soros, one of the wealthy people on our side of the fence, poured a ton of money into the political process, and that ton of money brought him the ability to buy a living, a daily living, food and housing for a whole cadre of young idealists. And he put together Move On and Truth Out, and those were enormously helpful on our side of things. Then the first Obama campaign, presidential campaign, was brilliant in terms of mobilizing us, using using Twitter, but more important than Facebook and Twitter, using the principles of Facebook and Twitter on his own pages, so you could set up your own homepage on Obama.com. It wasn't called that, or whatever it was called. And then he gave you all kinds of tools you could use to personalize your page and propagandize your friends, selling them Obama T-shirts and throwing Obama parties and throwing Obama call-ins, and they're still trying to organize like that. They've been trying to organize in the 2 years that Obama's been in the White House. But in some way, they have lost it. In some way, they've lost our participation. In some way, they've lost giving us a voice. Now they're just dictating to us. And as a consequence, they've lost our enthusiasm. They showed promise of engaging us in the process of governing, but then they failed to engage us in the process of governing. But at least they showed us a tool that we can pick up and run with, that we can take further. And no one has really known the story of how that campaign was put together, and how the internet was used, and who were the geniuses behind it, and why they lost it. Because if you understand why you lost it and you understand what you had, you can understand better how to take it to the next level. And we do have to take it to the next level. Look, in Egypt, these kids do not have a lot. Yes, they do have a lot. They're middle-class kids, but without jobs, but they have a university education. Their parents have money. The system has somehow given them the money. But they used what they had, which is far less than we have. They used the internet, and they used Facebook, and they used Twitter in ways that we haven't. And they pulled a movement together, and they made sure they focused on one thing. That one thing was Mubarak must go. Now they have to make sure they don't do what the Obama administration did once it took power, that they don't lose it, that they don't lose the ability to focus on the next big thing. They have to know that the next big thing is the Constitution. They must have a democratic constitution, and they have to be in the room with these military bastards who have just taken over the country in the name of the people, because these military people could turn out to be great beneficiaries for the people of Egypt, but in all probability will not turn out to be. And unless the people who have run this movement, unless the people who brought this movement together, unless some people who can express, who can represent the sentiments of the people in that movement can sit in the room with equal power with these military bastards, they will not win their revolution. They must win the right to make their own constitution, not the military bozos. The military bozos know how to run tanks. They know how to run military campaigns. And frankly, they don't even know how to run military campaigns well. Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, took over the country in the name of the military in 1952 and shoved off the throne King Farouk, who was this 350-pound man who periodically, if I remember correctly, used to have himself weighed, and on the other side of the scale, it was a big weighing scale, with the pans on this side and pans on that side, and 350-pound disgusting Farouk would sit on one side, and then they'd pile the other side with gold until the two were balanced. Well, they got rid of King Farouk, and they brought in the military.
That's unfortunate. He seems like a pretty good leader.
Yeah, and then in 1956, Nasser had a great victory, or 1957. You know what his great victory consisted of? This shows you how brilliant the Egyptians are at military matters these days, or in the last half century.
No idea.
Well, Nasser declared that he was going to take over the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal had been built entirely with French money, and then the French had been incapable of carrying the debt that they'd loaded themselves up with for this canal, and the English had bought it. And 50% of its everything was given to the Egyptians, roughly 50%. That wasn't enough. Nasser wanted the whole thing, and he took it over. Well, the French and the English were not happy about this. This was their property. They were the ones who had invested the money to build the damn thing, for God's sakes. So they got the Israelis to front for them, and because the Israelis were not terribly interested in having the Egyptian army move closer to their borders, because the Egyptian army was at war with them. 5 nations had made war together. 5 Arab nations had joined together in 1948 to exterminate the state of Israel, to drive its Jews into the sea, to rape its women, and take its radios. And they'd failed. Well, not all of those countries were still at war in 1957 with the state of Israel, all with the intention, and Nasser had said this over and over again, of exterminating the Israelis. So it was to the Israelis' benefit when the French and the English wanted to go and get a canal to work with the French and the English. So the French, the English, and the Israelis went to take back to the canal and got it. Then guess what happened?
No idea.
Dwight Eisenhower decided he didn't want them to take this over, that this was an imperialistic gesture. And because the United States held all the cards in the world at the time, we'd just come out of World War II. Germany and France, or France and England, were devastated. Only America had the ability to produce goods, and America had all the money. And France and England still owed America a lot of money. So America called in its chips as a mighty power with these countries that had emptied themselves out in World War II and said, no, 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 you cannot do that, and made them withdraw. Well, that was Nasser's great victory. And that made Nasser a hero, a superstar, not just in Egypt, but in the Arab world. And nation after nation after nation in the Islamic world had a Nasser-like coup. And all of them gained Nasser-like leaders. That's how we got Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who grew up reading Nasser's Little Green Book, which was his imitation of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, his little pamphlet on how I did it, how I became a hero for the Islamic people. At any rate, so that's it is. If that's the biggest victory the Egyptians could win, then give me a break. Now, apparently it was, because you know how Mubarak got his fame? He's a military war hero too.
I don't know how he got his fame. I know how he got in power, but I'm not sure. I don't know how he got
Well,
his fame prior to that.
1967, the five Islamic countries, the five Arab countries that had vowed to exterminate Israel and that were still technically at war with Israel with the intention of exterminating Israel, were conniving to exterminate Israel and preparing for a war on Israel again. And the Israelis are not stupid, and when they see tanks lining up not far from their borders, I mean, they can draw conclusions. When they see the Air Force drawing together around their borders of Syria and Egypt, I mean, you know, put two and two together, for God's sakes. So instead of waiting for the attack, they decided to wipe out the Egyptian and Syrian Air Force and military before they could attack. And they did. And then they wanted a buffer zone, a great big stretch of desert between them and the Egyptians, so it would be harder for the Egyptians to pull this kind of thing off in the future. So the Israelis advanced into the Sinai Desert. And they advanced to the point where they had cornered the entire Egyptian Fifth Army, and within 24 hours could have wiped the whole fucking army that threatened them with extermination out. And guess how the Egyptians pulled off a military victory in the face of defeat?
No idea.
They got Richard Nixon to send a little Jewish man named, oh God, what was his name? Henry Kissinger. I was blank on the big name. Named
yeah, that's
Henry
not an obscure figure, but yeah.
Yes, to Israel. No, I don't blank on the obscure ones. You know that. So at any rate, they got him to go to Israel and say, no, 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 you must not touch the Egyptian army. Remember, all your weapons come from us. Touch the Egyptian army. No more weapons. The Egyptians will exterminate you. Do I make myself clear? And the Egyptians did not exterminate the Egyptian Fifth Army. That was Mubarak's great victory that made him a war hero. The Egyptians not done too well with war heroes. So it's the Egyptian military that pulled off these astonishing feats of military valor and smarts, astonishing tactical and strategic smarts that got them in a position where they could have been wiped out over and over again. That's going to run the country and form the next constitution. The very organization that gave us Gamal Abdel Nasser, Mubarak, and the current constitution, the very organization that has, I mean, the big problem in Egypt is the plutocracy. The plutocracy has everything to do with the military. And what is a plutocracy? A plutocracy is a bunch of greedy people at the top who skim all the fat off and leave everybody else with crumbs. And that's the big complaint in Egypt, the plutocracy. Did I tell you in our last exciting episode about my ride with a cab driver from Newark?
No.
An Egyptian cab driver? Well, coming into Newark Airport, if you live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, is a tricky proposition because it's a 90-minute ride away. It's an $85 cab ride away. But it's a relatively uncongested airport. So I flew in from one of my fabulously successful lecture engagements with mobs of rupees and, all the rest, back to Newark Airport. There are no rupees. But at any rate, however, any rupees who would like, no, the woman I date, not like, at any rate, and I never have time. I'm always working. So at any rate, I
Oh,
mean,
you would make time.
research is more fun than sex, for God's sakes.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Thinking
We'll
is
see.
lots of fun. It is. It's really fun. Okay, so I get into a cab at Newark Airport, prepared for a 90-minute journey back to Park Slope, Brooklyn. And because I like to look out the window and see the sights, I ask if I can sit in the front seat. And once I sit in the front seat, I realize that the driver sitting right next to me has a funny foreign accent. So I ask him where he's from, and he says Egypt. Well, I ponder. Should I reveal my true identity or remain Clark Kent? And I decide, okay, I'll reveal my true identity. I'll take my life in my hands. And I say, well, I'm a Zionist and an atheist and a Jew, and I actually go on Iranian television as a Zionist, an atheist, and a Jew. And then I wait for him to take the knife out of the glove compartment and slit my throat. And he doesn't. But for the first 20 minutes or so of this ride, the conversation's a little bit awkward until I find out what really impassions him more than anything else in the world. And it turns out what's got his passions more than anything else in the world is the fucking goddamned plutocracy in his homeland of Egypt. It's the fact that a tiny, tiny number of families who are close to Mubarak have plundered this country, in his opinion, for all it is worth. They have made themselves super, super, super rich. I mean, the stories right now. Mubarak has $1 billion. This is Mubarak, who has told the world within the last 2 weeks he didn't really want to be the head of Egypt. He was forced to be the head of Egypt. He was brought unwillingly to be the head of Egypt. That's why he skimmed $70 billion off the top. Give me a break. But there's a whole bunch of other families up there with him, skimming the riches off the top, but not knowing how to make riches, which leaves very little for the people beneath them. And this Egyptian cab driver was absolutely furious. And by the time we finished the cab ride, he said, I don't care if you are Zionist. I don't care if you are atheist. I don't care if you are a Jew. If we had more people like you in Egypt, we could get rid of this vampirical plutocracy. Now, tonight, before I came home to figure out how to use all of this hardware and software so that we could do our interview, and it wasn't easy, as you know, I dropped in to the Fifth Avenue sandwich shop, a 24-hour-a-day sandwich shop. Now, the food industry in Brooklyn is increasingly run by a small number of Egyptian families, and this is an Egyptian market. So I ordered my sandwich, and I walked over to the counter, and I told the extremely cheerful — Egyptians tend to be very cheerful, very charming, very delightful, even if they do want to slit your throat, which, they don't want to slit yours, but I'm Jewish and an atheist and a Zionist and a Jew, so what, I have different problems. At any rate, and I always give him a report on what adventures I'm up to that week, because I have all these strange adventures. And I explained that I have been trying to get to a position where I can actually talk to the people running these street demonstrations in Egypt, because they could use a brain trust. It always helps to have a mind you can bounce things around with like a handball. Because the more you bounce things around with other smart minds, assuming that I've got a smart mind, which is not all that certain, but at any rate,
some people contend that I've seen their
there,
comments.
but don't tell them.
A lot of people contend that about me as well. So
yes, well, you're smart. I know that. Okay.
same
At any rate,
there.
um, so I told him that I've been working the department. That they had this thing at the Office of the Secretary of Defense for my second book, Global Brain, and I've been calling the people that they introduced me to see how I can get to talk to some of these Egyptian leaders to help them achieve their goals and make sure they're not knifed in the back the way the Mensheviks were knifed in the back by the Bolsheviks, the way the secular revolutionaries of Iran were knifed in the back by the Ayatollah, and the way the people who thought that they were having a revolution for freedom of speech and democracy in Cuba were knifed in the back by Fidel Castro. I want to make sure these people get what they felt that they were revolutionizing for. And when I explained this to the Egyptian behind the counter and confessed for the first time that I am a Zionist, an atheist, and a Jew, he stuck his hand across the counter, had a huge smile on his face, and said, oh no, he didn't stick his hand, he did the fist thing like that. Bumping fists.
Right.
And said, I want you to succeed. You want a Zionist to succeed? What kind of nutty world is this? But that's the strength and the power of the American example and the European example and even the Turkish example of democracy and freedom of speech. It really is exerting its call for the first time to the people of the Middle East, and that includes especially the Egyptians, but also the Tunisians, and to a smaller extent, the people in Yemen, to a small extent, well, possibly a larger extent, the people in Jordan. But that leads to another big puzzle here, which we emailed about before we went on camera. Mm-hmm. That is the mystery of the J curve.
And I had to look that up because I didn't know what it was.
Aha. Well, it's in my third. Well, I can't keep them straight. It's in my second book. No, it's in one of my books.
It's in a book somewhere with the name Howard Bloom on it.
Yes, I think it's in the Lucifer Principle, actually. And the mystery is this. Okay, let's start with China. China has become, unbeknownst to most of us in North America who think that we still have waving seas of grain, which we do, and they're waving seas of grain that used to save Russia and Asia and Europe when they had famines from approximately 1800 on. Well, we've been eclipsed. We're no longer the biggest grain-producing nation in the world. We're not even the biggest wheat-producing nation in the world. Do you have any idea of who the biggest wheat-producing nation in the world is?
China.
You've got it! Wheat made in China! Are you ready for that? Bread made in China. But there's a problem this year. They've apparently had major climate problems in China. And the result is that the wheat harvest is failing. Now, guess what that has done to worldwide food prices?
Skyrocketing.
It has skyrocketed them. Now, guess what happens when you have skyrocketing food prices?
Well, a lot of things happen, but
well,
I'm assuming you're speaking of one specific effect.
Yes, one specific thing. They're called bread riots. And they've been happening ever since the 1780s in France.
Probably before then.
Yes, and guess what bread riots produce in the days post 1789? Revolutions! The revolution in Tunisia and the revolution in Egypt happened because the price of food was going up. Now, why in the world do we have revolutions when the price of food is going up? Okay, that's problem number one. Problem number two, I haven't been able to check out the statistics, but apparently if you look them up, you discover that the standard of living in Egypt is rising, that the percent of people in the middle class has been growing, that Egypt has, under Mubarak recently, has apparently been doing fairly well at moving up. And the people in Tunisia have more freedom than any other people in the Middle Eastern Islamic world, in the Mediterranean basin. They are more Frenchified, they're more Europeanized than any other of the people in what's called the Maghreb, the Arabic realm of Northern Africa. And you would expect that when things are getting better, you wouldn't have revolutions. You'd have revolutions when people are starving. But let's look at the revolution. The revolution in France happened when things were getting relatively better. And when the king was liberalizing, the king was reforming things, when the king was opening up new freedoms. The revolution in Iran happened when things were getting better. The standard of living in Iran was shooting up. The standard of education in Iran was shooting up. Freedom for women in Iran was shooting up. Everything was shooting up. And they had a revolution. Why do we have revolutions? Not when things are horrible, but when things are getting better. And then why do we have revolutions when things are getting better, but there's a little minor downturn, like the price of bread is going up 5 cents or 20 cents
No idea.
or even 50 cents? Well, I've been trying to figure it out.
You're gonna have
And
to fill me in on this.
as I was pondering tonight's Howard the Humongous Amazing Atheist episode, it finally occurred to me. When people are starving, they don't have the energy for revolution. Revolution can be extremely costly. Let's look at birds, okay? And this is in the Lucifer Principle, my first book. Some birds try out new foods, and some birds refuse to try out new foods. Now, you would think that the birds that are going to try out new foods are the birds who are starving to death. After all, whatever they've been eating isn't panning out for them. They're about to die because there isn't enough of it. And if they tried out something new, they might find something new to eat. So you'd think that they're the great adventurers, the great Epicureans, the ones testing out new cuisine all the time, the ones wondering what the hot new cuisine in town is. Not true. The ones who are the great cuisine testers, the ones who are the great novelty testers, are the birds who are doing well. They're the birds who've already got enough to eat. Now, does this make any sense? I'll tell you what sense it makes. Okay?
Tell me.
If you are,
Help me out here.
this is gonna be hard for you to imagine, TJ. If you have been slimmed down to the shape of an Auschwitz victim, and all that's left of you is skin and bones, and you try out something new and it turns out to be the wrong thing, your body doesn't have the energy to recuperate from it. Your body doesn't have the energy to make it to the next piece of food. Recuperating from something that assaults your system is costly. It takes a lot of energy. So you are better off not trying new things, but for looking for something that is tried and true because you can't afford to get it wrong. Does that make sense?
I get it so far.
Okay. Birds that are starving, the birds on the top of the tree literally get the most to eat. They're the birds on the top of the hierarchy. The birds on the bottom of the tree get very little to eat. And they barely have enough energy to make it through the next day. So if the next day is not successful for them and they make the wrong decision and they burn their energy in the wrong way, they are dead. Birds who are starving cannot afford mistakes. They can't afford luxuries. They can't afford novelty. But birds who are doing well, birds who are fat, can overcome the problems they might encounter in making a mistake. They have the energy with which to recuperate. They still have the energy to make change. And better to make change while you've still got the energy than to be stuck in a position where you can't afford any change at all. So the J curve happens when you're doing really well. You're on an upward trajectory. Let me see if I got that trajectory here. No, it goes this way from your point of view. The trajectory is really moving up and has been for a long time. And then suddenly you hit a little downward spike, a tiny little downward spike. Well, that downward spike says, uh-oh, things could be getting worse. Change things now. Try out novelties now, because if they continue to get worse, you are not going to have the energy anymore. That's why the J curve works. That's why we have bread riots. We tend to have bread riots where people have been doing very well or relatively well on a strong upward streak for a while, and then suddenly run into a bump, and things go in a short jag downward. And that's what we had in Tunisia and Egypt. So that's it. It was a big thing for me to figure out because I've been working on it for 20 years.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but when you were doing the whole graph thing with your hands, you had it right the first time.
Oh my God! All right, okay.
I'm sure people can compensate in their minds, but I just wanted to.
Yes, if they still have the energy, provided they haven't been starved for too long. So that's it.
That's the,
but this is a cosmos constantly searching out her possibilities, and she does do it through a balance of opposites, and it's a dynamic balance between opposites. It's
I want to just interject something here.
okay. Interject something.
I think it actually build on the point you're about to make.
Right.
Not that I know what it is, but I think I see where you're going. Um, and this kind of ties into the Egypt thing too. Let me just. I kind of mentioned this briefly in our Skype earlier, but children, they rebel against their parent at a certain age. It's almost invariably across the board.
Right.
No matter what kind of parents they have, whether they're a strict parent or a very tolerant parent or whatever, there's going to be some what you would call differentiation.
Right.
They, they
Exactly.
they seek out their own identity, um, and I think it goes both ways too. It's not. I mean, we think of it as kids rebelling against their parents. I think parents kind of rebel against their kids too, in a sense, because
Well, that's a good point.
it's
That's
not
an
as
interesting one. I like that.
it's not as well perceived because of the power distribution there. But there's this certain element in most parent-child relationships of trying to ideologically derail one another. To establish your own identity from the enemy, whether that be your parent or your child. I know that this is a very anecdotal evidence, obviously, but my father always used to perceive uh, defects in my brother and I so that he could kind of feel better about himself. And I think from my conversations with others, this is not some unique
Oh,
characteristic
I
or
think it's very
exclusive to
normal.
him. If we didn't have enough girlfriends, so he used to distinguish himself by saying, "Oh, when I was your age, I was getting so much pussy and all this." And
Oh my God,
he didn't
that's so
really,
like
he
your
didn't,
father.
he didn't really want us to succeed because when we did get some girls in our lives, he was very critical of that too. It was like, "Oh, you're focusing too much energy on girls, and you're not, not enough on your
No,
work."
what a
You know,
con.
it's like some people view the criticisms of their parents as just the influence of authority, but I see it as at least partially the attempt of the parent to assert their identity as well. Because I mean, towards the beginning of a parent-child relationship, it's almost like they're an extension of one another. It's like my father used to say, he used to think of us when we were little kids as like the like little clones. It's like, oh, this is me. This is a part of me. And then later on, the teenager needs to differentiate himself from his parents, and I think the parent needs to differentiate themselves from their kids. They need to say, no, this is not a clone of me. This is a unique person, and there are differences here, and we need to let each other go to an extent so that we can, go out in the world and go on with our lives. Um, so kids need to find an identity, and parents need to rediscover their autonomy. I think the same thing happens in these revolution scenarios. It's not just a matter of people trying to find an identity. It's a matter of Mubarak or any other dictator. They're trying to defend themselves. They're trying to understand themselves as anything, but the fearless leader archetype that they envision themselves as. Surely, I think that's why Mubarak took so long to step down until everyone thought he was going to step down days earlier. He did not. I don't think he didn't know how to be anything but the autocrat, the guy in charge. He wasn't willing to find an identity outside of that, and
Well, it's
I'm
kind
kind
of
of
hard.
unsure. I'm kind of unsure about where I'm going to this, but I
Yeah.
think it's.
No, but I think that it's a brilliant little mini essay, and I think it's right on target. Look, we all attention is the oxygen of the human soul. Attention is more important to us in many ways than food, clothing, and shelter. If you that this is another little fact from the Lucifer Principle from my first book, but back in World War One, when some bozos got the idea of taking these flimsy little things made of paper and cloth stretched over these wooden frames called airplanes and putting them into the war-making effort. Then somebody got at first they were used for reconnaissance, then somebody got the idea of taking his pistol up there. Then once he had his pistol up there, he got the idea of shooting at other people from the other side in their planes. Then somebody else got the idea of taking a bomb up there and dropping it. And eventually things got very aggressive up there in the air, and a lot. But these are flimsy little devices, and they crash a lot. And when you're up at a high height trying to shoot another guy with your pistol, from the other side, you stand a good chance of crashing simply because you've lost track of which direction you're going. So there were, that's very costly to train somebody in one of these devices, and it's very costly to make these devices, for God's sakes. You don't want just one of them crumpling up all over the place and burning. So somebody came up with the idea of taking this great big piece of cloth and hanging it above them, shooting it above them so that it would slow down their motion as they came toward the ground, save at least the lives of the pilots, who were expensive to train. But the pilots wouldn't touch these things. They were called parachutes. Do you have any idea why the pilots wouldn't touch these things?
I have no idea whatsoever. It seems
Attention is the oxygen of the human soul. And as long as they were riding around on these things, shooting at each other with their pistols, they thought they were the hottest thing on the planet Earth. And that when they walked into the local bar, when they finally landed, if they landed in one piece, they'd have pussy galore. They'd have 15 girls all wanting to fuck them immediately. I mean,
so this is like the same reason that the cool kid doesn't want to wear his bicycle helmet. Then basically,
yeah, and the same reason the kids played chicken and took it to the edge and went off the cliff in the days of James Dean, because the guy who ends up on top of it, who can come out alive from these experiences, gets all the attention. It's called adventure. And if you're the guy who wears the parachute, you're going to walk into a bar and girls are going to go, "Oh my God, what's he doing in here?" Well, again, attention is it. When we were competing, when your dad was putting you down and trying to find fault with you, he was competing for attention with you. He was afraid you were going to get the attention. He set up a little stage on which you got attention according to how much pussy you'd gotten. And if you weren't getting any, he could tell you how much he was getting, and there he was right at the center of the spotlight. But if you came in with getting more girls than he was getting, he switched the stage.
Yeah.
He put the spotlight over a different stage entirely.
Now it's about industriousness, right?
Yeah. Why? So that he could still get the center of attention. It was as simple as that. Once upon a time, back when I was sick, in particular, 15 years in bed, and had a very difficult time finding ways of finding people who would want me in their lives, because there I was laying in a bed, for God's sakes. I used to help people get through their romantic relationships. I'd guide them. I'd coach them. I'd be like the little voice on their shoulder, guiding them step by step through these relationships. And one day, I had this friend, and she had a boyfriend, and she was 5'4", and he was 6'4", and she was absolutely delighted with that. And she thought she was crazy about him. And then one day she got into a fight with him, and she couldn't understand what it was all about. He had come to her and said, "I have a cold." And she had come back later in the day and said, "I have a cold too." And he had gotten extremely angry, and they ended up having a big fight. Do you know why? Having a cold is it's a bid for attention. And walking in and saying to your girlfriend, "I have a cold," you're hoping she'll make a great big fuss over you. But then if she walks in and says she has a cold, it means you're not the center of attention anymore, for God's sakes. What the fuck is she doing stealing the spotlight from you?
I remember when I was a kid, and I know I'm not the only one to do this, because I remember seeing the same thing in a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. I remember, I used to skid my knee, and then I'd, run into a room screaming in agony like it was the worst injury to ever occur in human history. And then when I noticed my mom wasn't in the room, I'd just stop and calmly walk to the next room. Then if she was in that room, I'd start the screaming routine again, like, my leg! This injury is so severe and horrible. You must comfort me. You must console me.
Gangrene. I'm about to be amputated. Now this has a great deal to do with the cosmos as a search engine, searching for her potential in life. The cosmos uses it. Families use this to set up a search engine too. And I must have told you the story before. There's a birth order researcher named Frank Sulloway. And Frank Sulloway researched thousands and thousands, I think tens of thousands of cases of twins and siblings and all kinds of things. And he discovered this. The first kid who comes out of the womb The first kid who manages to pop out. The first kid in the family. He's the good kid. Do you have any idea why?
Yeah, you told me this before. It was
I told you. Okay, so the good,
how did it
but you've
play
got a
out? Do
family.
a brief
Okay,
recap for the people who didn't see the
okay.
episode, though.
So the good kid, eh, everything he learns what his parents like, and he does it because it gets him lots and lots of attention. Every time he does something his parents like, it gets him attention. So he's the kid who does everything his parents like. The second kid comes along, and that attention slot is taken. That slot on the stage is taken already. There is no way you can outshine the good kid at being good. He's had a year or two of practice at it, for God's sakes, by the time you come along. But there is a way you can get your parents' attention. There is a slot untaken on the stage. It's called being the bad kid. Now, you don't get the kind of enthusiasm and praise that the other kid gets, but hell, which is better? Attention in which people loathe you, or no attention at all?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out for most of us, loathing is infinitely better than nothing at all. We die without attention. Attention is the oxygen of the human soul. And this forces us to differentiate. By the time
Have
you've got six kids, you've got six kids, each of whom has tried to find his own slot and attention space. Each of them has tried to find his own space on the attentional stage. And the result is you got six different kids, each taking a different direction in life. Now, when your family is in trouble, or even in good times when there's opportunity around, who's more likely, what family is more likely to find the latest opportunity? The family that has six different approaches to it, or the family that only has one?
yeah. The one that
It's like
has
spreading your fingers out
multiple
to
little
find a yeah, it's a
behavioral tendrils.
yeah,
We have all these archetypes here. It's not just one
right. And the example that's
strategy.
used in the Genius of the Beast, which may not be the best example in the world, but is have you ever lost your contact lens on a shag rug?
Well, I don't wear contacts, but
All right. Well, I have, and when you do, you don't just run one finger through the carpet over and over again. You run all your fingers through the carpet, and that's what having five kids is like. That's what having five subcultures in Egypt is like. That's what having five subcultures in America is like. Believe me, the people who love Ron Paul, much as you and I loathe Ron Paul, are doing us a favor because they're stretching in a different direction and they're adding to our repertoire of possibilities. Now let's just make sure they don't take over. And even Rush Limbaugh and what's his name Glenn Beck, are to a certain extent expanding our minds because we, in reacting against them, think all kinds of thoughts we wouldn't think without them.
you're probably right about that. And they do push your the little buttons and get the passion going too.
Right, and that keeps us, and that really motivates us to get out there and be fingers, to get out there and, as you just said, be tendrils on behalf of the society, little search antennae on behalf of the society, probes on behalf of the
I was
society.
just when you were talking about what was the name of the guy who figured this out with the siblings.
Frank Sulloway.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that in terms of American, probably not exclusively American, but just celebrity culture in general. How, especially when it comes to like child stars, how they like, oh, aren't they cute and aren't they lovable and aren't they adorable? And then the public kind of grows sick of them, and then all of a sudden they totally change gears and become these Hollywood bad boys and bad girls, always doing something, always getting drunk and trashing hotel rooms and stealing necklaces, and and then they end up in the papers, as everyone still knows who they are, still talks about them.
Well, that's a good
It's not
point.
positive attention anymore, but they're still getting attention.
Well, when Lindsay Lohan can't get attention as being a delectable little piece of prepubertal pussy anymore, and when she can't get, and when what's her name, Britney Spears can't get attention for having that incredible 15-year-old little hip waist ratio, tiny little waist anymore, they can get tons of attention for beating up their kids and trying to shove them into the backs of automobiles in parking lots.
Very true. That's what that's I never thought about it from that perspective until you
Oh,
started.
you just said it. All I'm doing is
Well,
filling out.
I know, but I'm saying until just now when you were telling me recapping for the second time the Soloway. I'm probably already forgetting his name. The
Yeah, that's it. You got it.
Okay, Frank Soloway. Was it Frank? It was Frank.
Frank Holloway. Yep.
Okay, when you were talking about that, when you were recapping it, because I'd heard it before and it didn't occur to me then, but this time it did. Anyway,
Well, we should wrap up early
we,
because we have all kinds of technical problems tonight,
we
and
do.
TJ and I
I,
spent an hour being techies and
I
trying to
know.
solve
I know
problems.
we want to wrap up, but I did get some audience questions. I'd like to ask at
I
least
just
one
want
of.
to tell the audience that we're working on a computer that's so primitive that it was actually made of flint and approximately 2.5 million years ago. Um, and nonetheless, we are getting sound and we are getting video to you, despite the fact that we are working
Very
with,
elaborate cave paintings, those.
yes, very
I
elaborate
would
cave
like to at
paintings.
least ask one of these questions before
He's
we.
actually smearing all this with his fingers on the side of the cave right now.
Right, exactly.
Okay, questions from the audience. Yes,
Uh,
here we are, ready for questions from the
if you
audience.
want, I'll give you a choice here. I have 4 questions that I thought were pretty good. I can ask all 4 of them, and you can give
No, no,
brief
no, one at
answers.
a time,
Or
one at a time. No, no, one at a time.
oh well, no, I'm giving you, but that's not the option. Let's hold on for a
Oh,
second. I mean, I know you're wanting to go because it's pretty late now at this point. But I can either ask one and you can give a very long, elaborate answer, or I can ask all 4 of them and you give like kind of more brief answers to them if
we'll
brevity
have
is
to
in your
play it by
repertoire.
ear. You will have to play it by ear, TJ. Anything I
Okay.
pause once in certain
I will
so we
ask them in
with
order of
the
what I
five
find most
minutes.
interesting, and you can just tell me when you want to go.
Okay.
Okay, this is from Jeremy. Jeremy Tauber, who is
Oh, I know Jeremy Tauber, I
yeah,
think.
you did an interview with him.
Oh, yes.
Um, he says, as a person who once worked with musicians, do you believe that the RIAA has a right to shut down LimeWire and attack torrent sites? Basically, sort of
Okay, I'm not really expert
file
in.
sharing,
Yeah,
all that stuff.
yeah.
What is your
I
opinion
think
there?
look, you got to have some mechanism for paying artists, or they won't continue to make music for you. So that's what your obligation is as a music listener, and unfortunately, it's mine too. I actually am now paying the 3 cents a year or whatever it is to. I think it's $3 a year to Pandora for my free music because I like free music too. But you got to work out a compromise here. If you starve your artists to death, you won't have any artists anymore. Should the RIA be trying to stop every new technology in sight? Didn't they learn a lesson when they actually stopped digital? It was digital audio recording back in the 1980s, and they stopped it dead in its tracks. Did it save them? Not by any stretch of the imagination. So the RIA has to be more flexible and work out payment mechanisms that make sense, like Pandora's payment mechanism. I mean, it is something like $3.60 a year or something like that for Pandora.
And
It's mod.
you can get it for free if you're willing to tolerate some ads here.
Yeah, if you're willing to tolerate the ads, and then they get paid through another means. But you have to look. Don't screw people. The bottom line is don't screw people. Don't try to steal from people. If you try to steal from people, ultimately the person you're going to impoverish is you because you won't have the music anymore.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember I would like to say though that I was listening to an interview, not a whole interview, but a segment interview with author, novelist Neil Gaiman, and he was talking about the fact that he saw his sales increase because of people sharing his books online. I don't know if it's the same with music. Probably
Well,
not necessarily because it's. I think
let
it
me
would. I think it might be the same with music if you weren't charged so much for music, but you know.
let me tell you a story. In 1922, 600 radio. Well, the recording industry started in around 1900. Thomas Edison had invented the gramophone, and you made records on these big platters of this stuff called bakelite, and if you sat on it, it cracked immediately. And you did it with a needle; it was almost the size of your finger. You played it with a needle; it was almost the size of your finger. Then the needle wore out after just playing 2 or 3 records. It was a real pain in the tuchus. Nonetheless, there was a guy named Enrico Caruso, and he was a great opera singer, and his music was so incredibly popular that by 1905, he had sold 5 million of these Bakelite impossible platters called records. 5 million in 1905. So the record industry all of a sudden became a very big thing. Up until then, it had been the sheet music industry that was a big thing in the music business. Then, in 1922, there was this new invention, and it finally came to fruition. People were finally beginning to commercialize it. It was called radio. And 220 radio stations were licensed in 19, or no, it was, I forget the exact number now. I've always known it very well. I forget it. But it was over 200 radio stations that were licensed in 1922. And all of a sudden, the record industry started quaking in its pants. And it was absolutely certain that people could get their music for free on the radio. They wouldn't buy it anymore. So in 1928, when radio really took off in a big way, they started putting these great big labels on these Bakelite discs that said, warning, if you try to play this damn thing for free to anyone, anywhere in the universe, we will come after you with the FBI and man-eating dogs. We will have you nibbled to death by piranhas. It had all kinds of threats. And then a strange thing happened in the 1930s. Like, nobody stopped playing the music on the radio because of these dire warnings. And all of a sudden, the record industry made an amazing discovery. Do you have any clue as to what it was?
Yeah, I think I can figure it out.
Yeah, the more times the records got played on the radio, the more records they sold. And by the 1950s, they were giving DJs payola to play these damn things for free. And by the 1960s, they were giving them so much cocaine that it was a miracle their brains didn't turn into white powder. Actually, some did. Just to get free airplay. Because it sold records. Now, whether it does this with books or not is very hard to say. But everybody's got to look at this with more of a sense of balance. Things are very rarely an either-or situation. Opposites are joined at the hip, and usually if you take a little from column A and a little from column B and add them, you get a much more sensible solution.
I agree with that answer. This is a question from Molly. She asks, teachers try to spread a message of don't bully to everyone in the school. It's getting really annoying because they practically shove it down our throats. So I guess these kids are being bullied about not bullying. Do you think that this is actually not helping at all?
I have no idea because I haven't been in the school system, but I think bullying is loathsome and despicable, but I have a personal stake in this. You know, I'm not an unbiased observer. I was bullied from the time I was 3 years old to the time I was 18 years old, or 16 years old, or something of the sort. And it's not pleasant. And yeah, and it has advantages. I mean, I got a tremendous amount out of bullying because it drove me to the edge of society and gave me a very, very peculiar point of view on things. And I am extraordinarily grateful for that peculiar point of view. But bullying is nasty, terrible, vicious business, and I think we should be doing everything we can to stop it.
Do you think it's do you think there really is an effective way of going about doing that, or?
No, I think the kids have their own society. They keep things very, very private. They know how to keep things from adults. And as a consequence, adults usually don't have a clue. Plus, kids can be bullied for going to their parents about the fact that they're being bullied.
Yeah, that's kind of my mindset. I really don't see how you stop something that's kind of just nature. I mean, I guess you can maybe subvert it in some ways, but I mean, we should do everything we can to alleviate the situation. But I don't think we can put a yellow ribbon on it and say, okay, we solved bullying. On to the next issue.
Well, you know, there's even a chance, but it's just a chance, that all the bullies get together and they pick on the scapegoat, the poor kid at the bottom of the pile, for bullying. Because one thing that research about bullying indicated in the 1980s, it's a long time ago, was bullies think they're the ones being bullied. Bullies often bully because they just think that all they're doing is evening things.
Very strange outlook. I've never heard that before. I have to think about that.
Because the biggest bullies are not necessarily the people on the top of a society. The people on the top of a society, this is not just true for people, this is true for baboons and chimpanzees. The males who are actually on top use very little physical aggression because they have the power of their position and they know it. It's the males on the outskirts, who end up being violent. And the bullies are really males on the outskirts for the most part, not males who are socially accepted. The males who are in the flow and are very much the aristocrats don't need to bully in the conventional way. That, at least, is my impression from a lot of research on animal behavior.
I can kind of see that now that I'm thinking about it.
Well, now, on the other hand, the kid who bullied me from the time I was 3 years old to the time I was 8 years old had both skills. He was his father and mother were marginal. His father had manic depression. His father was crippled and was a saxophone player of all things. His mom was a shrew. Knew he was at the outside of things socially in terms of not being born into the nicer families. But he was also a terrific social organizer. And his sense of persecution turned him into a bully, but at the same time, he was a great social organizer, and he organized. My street was called Hartwell Road, and he organized the Hartwell Gang. When he was 4.5 years old or less, he organized the Hartwell Gang. Well, what did he lead the Hartwell Gang in doing? Bullying me. That was their big cohesion mechanism. And he ultimately thought he was my best friend. So there are elements of marginalization that led to his being a bully, and yet he did have some social skills. But that's generalizing from one case. The research tends to indicate that the ones who have the brawls in the bar rooms and who fight and beat people up, those are the ones who are really marginalized, and they are trying to get into the center of things. You don't see Rockefellers beating people up.
Yeah, we'll end with one last question here. This is from Kyle. He says, "Whenever I see a good deed, I always sorry, I don't know why I'm having such trouble reading these questions. Whenever I see somebody do a good deed..."
Literacy problem, TJ. A serious literacy problem.
It's probably because of the way it's written rather than the way I'm saying it. But
just like your father, blaming it on them, huh?
It's all their fault.
Yes.
Whenever I see somebody do a good deed, I always see they expect something for it, whether it be material, money, cars, blowjobs, or the examples he gives, or just to feed their egos. And I guess he wants you to expand on that, maybe tell him if he's right or wrong. Or
my suspicion is you're utterly wrong. My suspicion is that there are a lot of people who do good things just for the sake of doing good things because it makes us feel, some of us, I mean, I do a lot of good things to the best of my ability, and I do them because they make me feel good. It makes me feel good to feel that I've done something that's meant something to somebody else. It's back to attention being the oxygen of the human soul. It reassures me that I mean something to this person. I don't have to be given anything else for it.
Doesn't that just fall under the category of feeding their egos, though?
Well, no, not necessarily. It does feed I don't know, everything by that definition could be feeding your ego. But it's not, there's no external reward involved. But people who think that other people do things only for motives of getting a blowjob or making money or feeding their ego tend to be people who only do things for the sake of getting a blowjob, feeding their ego, and making money. People who accuse other people of lying generally turn out to be liars. People who accuse other people of stealing generally turn out to be thieves. It's a very peculiar proposition. We are very good at projecting our own limitations and our own strengths onto other people.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that to an extent. I think that the feed their egos thing, it's kind of an overly broad category because that's not necessarily a negative thing. I mean, it's if helping someone else makes you feel better about yourself, that's not bad.
No, not at all. An ego is one of the most valuable things in society. It's one of the most underrated things. And there's another Bloomism that goes along with that opposites are joined at the hip. And that's every good thing in overdose is a poison. Ego and overdose is a poison. But ego is your flotation cushion. Ego is what gives you your sense of your aspirations. Ego is what keeps you going in the months and days and years it takes you to actually achieve those aspirations. Ego is, the TJ just said, it's what makes you feel good about yourself when you actually have some justification for feeling good about yourself, for God's sakes. Without it, we would all die. We would all shrivel. We would all become nothing. Stop pummeling ego. Stop beating up on ego. Stop bullying ego, for God's sakes.
We need
Just
to
don't let it overdose you. Don't let it poison you.